Hello. Today I want to talk about Chapter 5 of B.B. Price's book on medieval thought, this one dealing with the Vernacular Breakthrough. The book, as I've said before, came out in 1992. We'll talk about the first section on the Latin presence today and then look at the other sections later. So, the vernacular breakthrough. One of the most important contributions of the Middle Ages is the development of indigenous local languages. They have played a major role in linguistic history, but also the social, political, and religious history of Europe, especially in the evolution of national cultures in the British Isles, France, Germany, Scandinavia, Spain, Italy, and so on. The barbarian languages won out over Rome's Latin with both strengths and flaws. The first direct challenge to the hold of classical Latin was the popular use of vulgar Latin. Thus, by the 7th century, Gregory of Tours lamented his ignorance of proper Latin and hoped that faith would compensate for this deficiency. But Pope Gregory the Great in the late 6th century objected to having to use proper rather than vulgar Latin. At the height of Rome's power, Latin had been all-pervasive in the West. Therefore, writers in the early Middle Ages were still convinced that the language of cultivated Rome was best, with its style and its universality. But a shift in values and power was coming. Thus, Pope Gregory wanted to recognize the validity of using vulgar forms of Latin. And as Roman imperial power had faded, so too did its linguistic ideals of senatorial style and universal communication. There was no one single shift to indicate a vernacular breakthrough. Rather, each emerging language had its own trajectory. There were some common steps, such as the 12th century revival or Renaissance, as some would say, but others were unique. Latin remained a presence, however. During Rome's period of imperial greatness, Latin provided a cultural unity which eliminated any other linguistic expressions in the west of the empire. In the east, of course, Greek was co-equal and eventually dominant. As the Western Empire faded and was no longer able to maintain political unity, however, the Church perpetuated Latin dominance, and the Greek of the early Church gave way to Latin in the West. All Christian documents in the West, including the Bible, came to be written in Latin, and only Latin. Latin was thus conserved. The various major emerging European languages can be represented as belonging to four groups: the Romance, Germanic, British, and Slavonic. And first of all, let's talk about the Romance languages of Italy, France, and Iberia. These developed and preserved Latin in its vulgar form and eventually evolved into separate regional languages. During the 3 to 4 centuries of Roman occupation, the pre-Latin languages had apparently succumbed to Latin in all but the most colloquial communications, and vulgar Latin had been persistent enough to be adopted as the functional second language, even for the unlettered. When the hostile Germanic invaders arrived, these were the Alemanni, the Goths, the Franks, the Burgundians, the Huns, the Vandals, the Lombards, they had no long-term impact on vulgar Latin. Limited in their numbers, these so-called barbaric tribes became assimilated, leaving only a few words and place names of Germanic origin. Turning to the Germanic peoples of the north, these had never been incorporated into the Roman Empire, and their languages were free of Latin influence, and it was thus only through Christianity that they came to be incorporated into the Latin cultural sphere. They also adopted Latin as a useful alphabet, and through Christianized Anglo-Saxons incorporated Latin elements into their languages. But Old Saxon evolved into Old High German, and then to Middle High German without much Latin influence. By contrast, the situation in Britain was far more complex. Um, Britain, but not Ireland, had been part of the Roman Empire, but most of its Celtic inhabitants had resisted cultural assimilation, tenaciously maintaining their own spoken languages in everyday discourse and entertainment. Until the 6th century, a bilingual squirearchy, as Price describes it, of native Celts had held political power locally, using Latin with the Roman occupiers and the vernacular with the tenants. The Anglo-Saxons, who occupied the south and east of the main island after the Romans had gone, displaced the upper classes, and this led to the virtual displacement of Latin. Both the Anglo-Saxon and later Viking conquerors were only affected by Latin through Christianity. Like the Scandinavians, Latin offered them a useful alphabet and subtly influenced vocabulary and literary forms. The various Slavonic peoples were not discussed here, adopted, or some of them, at least in the east and south, adopted a modified form of the Greek alphabet rather than Latin. The survival of written Latin. When groups of Europeans ceased to speak Latin in the Middle Ages, the difficulties of preserving its written form was a key factor. Even in the classical period, there had been a divorce between written and spoken Latin, with some historians stating that Vulgar Latin already existed as a vernacular language by the 1st century AD. Certainly, there were different rhythms and modes of transformation in different areas as regional identities were asserted. Why then did literary Latin survive throughout the Middle Ages with both prestige and active use? We can identify 5 factors. Latin had emerged strongly from a falling Rome. It was used by the Western Church. It was used by the Cathedral Schools and later by the universities. It symbolized human civilization, culture and history, and it was considered the vehicle of certain literary genres. So first, Latin emerging strongly from a falling Rome. There was a revival in the use of Latin in the 4th century, initially in Gaul, where schools patronized by the Emperor Constantius I, the father of Constantine, flourished. By the mid-4th century, Christian writers like Jerome and Augustine were revitalizing the language, and you also have teachers like Donatus and later Macrobius and Boethius. The literary tastes of this 4th century revival were passed on in the Middle Ages. But the Roman imperial court and its patronage had disappeared, and from the mid-6th to the mid-8th century, there was a virtual demise of Roman culture. During this period, the greatest quantity of Latin literature ever to be lost vanished. Spoken and written Latin were now distinct, and whilst Vulgar Latin remained in wide use, few people became competent in written classical Latin. For example, Gregory of Tours' father, who was also his teacher, died when the boy was only 8, and he later explained his poor grammar as being due to this lack of guidance. Some degree of Latin literacy was sustained in the secular world through wealthy and powerful individuals who saw it as edifying, amusing, or a good education. But it was tenuous and sporadic to conserve the language outside of the church. Inevitably, classical Latin degenerated. At the same time, the evolution of vernacular languages accelerated. And by the 12th century, noble families came to enjoy literacy in the new vernacular writing. By the 13th and 14th centuries, there was increasing literacy, but in the vernacular, not in Latin. Latin was sustained by the church and the universities. Not until the 15th century, in Italy, was there again secular interest in the classics. Let's turn now to the church. Once Christianity had become institutionalized in Rome, the Western Church adopted Latin, and it would remain the language of the Church throughout the Middle Ages and beyond. Christian writers such as Avidius were active in the late classical Latin period, late classical Latin culture, and Jerome's 4th century translation of the Bible into Vulgar Latin became the standard of teaching Latin throughout the Middle Ages. The Church also shared in the loss of sophistication in Latin in the following centuries, even though the 7th century Anglo-Saxon missionary movement led to a revival in Latin in the monasteries they established on the European continent. As literate Christianity expanded, there was demand for more religious texts, both spiritual and scholarly, and monasteries dedicated whole rooms, scriptoria, to manuscript production. Numerous copies of liturgies, Bible commentaries, and church histories, such as the ecclesiastical history of the English people by the Venerable Bede, were made. All of this was in Latin, the monks conserving Latin learning throughout the Middle Ages. The next resurgence of religious Latin was linked to the new teaching institutions, first the Cathedral Schools and then later the universities. Academic Latin was enhanced in the 12th and 13th centuries through the translation of Greek and Arabic texts from Spain, Sicily, and Constantinople. This new learning ranged over subjects from anatomy to alchemy and zoology, and demanded an expanded lexicon in Latin. New words were devised by either transliteration or transformation. The result was that by the 13th century, Latin had become far more sophisticated, but also less accessible. This rarefication of the language was linked to increasing use of scholastic commentary and the dissection of newly available texts into philosophical minutiae. In the late Middle Ages, many academics became absorbed with the state of Latin grammar, turning to it and to logic as the keys to natural language and human thought. These were speculative grammarians who investigated the function of language through its abstract forms and relations. Next, we have Latin as a symbol for human civilization, culture, and history. And this was a sense that's continued throughout the Middle Ages. Even the invading barbarians were often in awe of Roman culture and sought to preserve its language and culture. Thus, King Theodoric commissioned Cassiodorus to write a history of the Goths in Latin, seeking to show that the Goths were an equally ancient and august people to the Romans. Law codes of common tribal law were codified and compiled in Latin, including the law of the Visigoths, the Salic law, and so on, between 400 and 800 AD. Charlemagne, king of the Franks, reportedly spoke Latin, as well as his mother tongue. Latin was often used in histories written in the Middle Ages and was used in the post-medieval Renaissance period as well, with histories in the vernacular only appearing in the late Middle Ages along with other prose narratives. Official documents, law codes, treaties, correspondence, and so on, were generally in Latin, though in the early Middle Ages the quality was often poor, as with the Merovingian dynasty who united the Franks, with the kings themselves learning the rudiments of Latin and employing Latinate court scribes. In government documents and those in courts of law, vernacular languages took over from Latin quite early on, however. The earliest surviving documents in both French and in German are from the formal Treaty of Strasbourg in 842 between Charles the Bald and Louis the German, both grandsons of Charlemagne. They determined to reconcile territorial disputes by means of an exchanged oath, understandable to both armies, neither body of men knowing Latin nor the language of their opponents. The audience dictated the development of official languages. In the reign of Charlemagne, official documents would have been in Latin, but by the 13th century they were in the vernacular for a local readership. This determined the language of composition. The linguistic watershed in political culture appears to have been in the late 13th century, as local communication between peoples of all classes became paramount. Finally, we have the idea that Latin was the vehicle for certain literary genres. For writers in the Middle Ages, Latin held a continuing prestige as the only language suitable for serious genres. There were early examples of serious vernacular literature in Middle High German in the 11th century and in Old English, that's Anglo-Saxon, but until the 13th century, work was largely limited to genres closely linked to the spoken word, notably the heroic epic and the lyric or alliterated poem. These included heroic epics in French, such as the Song of Roland, in Spanish, the poem of El Cid, German, and in Old English, Beowulf. Also lyric verse, religious homilies, and some technical and medical writings in German and English. French led the way in transforming the vernacular into a suitable vehicle for heroic epics and courtly love poems, and this was emulated in other languages. German added satirical political poems and the abstract and allegorical poetry of the 13th century. By the early 13th century, there were guides to vernacular composition, beginning with the Catalan Raymond Vidal's rules of lyric poetry. Despite losing out in verse, Latin retained its hold on literary prose, however, until the late Middle Ages, with the exception only of English. So thank you for listening, and particular thanks to my patrons, Sina Farzel, David Langness, Anthony Lee, Ian Palin, Johannes Rosenbaum, Steve Scholl, Ismail Valesco, Tobias Vetter, Tricia Williams, Jonah Winters, and Gloria Yazdani. You're always welcome to support my channel. Like, comment, and share on the videos if you will. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos, and I'll give Patreon and PayPal links below if you want to provide practical support. Next week, we'll talk about discovery of one's own tongue or language. Have a good day.